Picture this. You are shackled at the wrists, the iron biting cold against raw skin. Your feet bleed as they drag across frozen earth, every step echoing with pain. Around you, men, women, and children stumble together in a line of despair, the smoke of a distant village still rising behind them. The roar of longships fades, replaced by the shrill call of a horn. Shadows move between you and the firelight. A chieftain steps forward, his fur cloak brushing the ground, his gaze weighing the captives like livestock. And then the realization strikes with cruel clarity. You are not here to serve, nor even to labor. You are here to be owned, body and soul. For centuries, the Viking Age has been cloaked in a romantic haze. We picture rugged seafarers in horned helmets they never wore, warriors braving icy seas in search of gold and glory. The very word Viking stirs images of adventure, freedom, and conquest. Yet beneath this legend lies a far darker truth, one rarely told, and often deliberately forgotten. For every axe-wielding warrior who carved his name into saga and stone, there were dozens whose names never survived. Victims torn from their homes, stripped of identity, sold like cattle. These were not just field hands or domestic thralls. Some were condemned to a far more intimate and harrowing existence. They were what chronicles only whisper about: pleasure slaves. The old Norse word for slave, *threll*, later softened into thrall roles, easily off the tongue of poets and historians. But in its syllables hid horrors rarely written down. These were not merely human tools of labor, but captives, transformed into vessels for dominance, objects of status, symbols of possession. They were forced to exist not just as workers, but as extensions of their master's power, caught in rituals and appetites that blurred the lines between survival and obliteration. Their names were erased, their stories excised from sagas, and yet, in the gaps, in the silences, their shadows remain. Archaeologists and chroniclers left behind fragments, burial sites, foreign bones, sagas with suspicious silences, foreign travelers' horrified accounts. From these shards, a different Viking world emerges, one that is not about mythic warriors alone, but about the silenced multitudes who endured them. Our journey does not begin with the Vikings themselves, but with those they targeted. To understand the terror of the Viking Age, we must first stand among its victims. It is the mid-9th century, and the Frankish Empire, once united under Charlemagne's iron rule, is beginning to fracture. On the banks of the Seine, the city of Paris stands proud, its walls strong, its towers glinting in the spring sun. But beyond the horizon, cutting through the grey waters of the North Sea, come shapes that look like beasts' dragon-proud ships slicing up river like knives. At their head sails Ragnar Lodbrok, or a warlord bold enough to wear his name. Hundreds of warriors march inland, but their conquest is not limited to fire and plunder. They come for something else, something more permanent than treasure. They come for people. This is the truth beneath the Viking legend, that behind the songs of glory and adventure, another rhythm beat the sound of chains, of cries muffled into the night, of identities stolen and buried. And so, as we unravel this forgotten history, let us begin not with the victors, but with those shackled at their feet, whose suffering built the very foundation of Norse power. The year is 845. Charlemagne, the great unifier of the Franks, has been dead for 3 decades, and the empire he once held together with iron will and rivers of blood is fracturing. His sons squabble, nobles carve out their own spheres of influence, and the frontiers, once fortified, are vulnerable. Along the Seine, Paris rises as a jewel of Frankish pride, its walls tall, its churches echoing with bells, its markets brimming with wealth. But the strength of stone and mortar means little when terror approaches from the river itself. The water darkens with shadows. At first, the shapes seem like myths come to life. Longships, carved with dragon heads, sliding silently against the current. Dozens, then hundreds, their oars striking in rhythm like a war drum. Leading them is a name that even then carried the weight of legend, Ragnar Lodbrok. Whether it was truly him or merely a warlord assuming his mantle remains debated, but to the terrified eyes of the Franks, it hardly mattered. The dragon fleet had come. What followed was not just the familiar violence of plunder and fire. The Vikings did not arrive only to burn monasteries and loot golden chalices. They came for something that could not be melted down or recast human beings. Frankish chronicles speak with cold horror of entire villages disappearing overnight. Men capable of resistance were cut down where they stood. The elderly were slaughtered, their age making them worthless in the eyes of raiders. But the young and the strong were spared not from mercy, but from a different fate. They were bound, wrists raw against rope, necks tethered together like cattle, driven toward the riverbank where the ships waited. The journey back across the sea was the first crucible of their new existence, the beginning of a lifetime defined not by who they were, but by what they could be made to serve. The chronicler Nithard, writing in the mid-9th century, described the raids with despair. He noted not only the burned monasteries, but the silence of the countryside after Viking passage. Fields untended, villages empty, entire communities erased. For the Franks, it was more than a military defeat. It was the theft of their people, their future. And what awaited these captives across the sea? For some, it was the fate of the field slave, bending their backs to tend their captor's land. For others, it was domestic drudgery, hauling firewood, grinding grain, nursing children not their own. But for many, especially women, but not only women, there was another path, one that history whispers about only in fragments. They would be taken not as workers, but as flesh meant to validate power, as pleasure slaves. To the Norse, this was not an aberration. In their worldview, to dominate another person's body was not considered depravity. It was considered proof of strength. Conquest was not only measured in treasure or territory, it was inscribed on the flesh of the defeated. A captive's submission became the canvas upon which a master painted his dominance. From the very first raids, this pattern emerged. Villages along the Seine, the Loire, the coasts of Ireland and Scotland all told the same tale. When the longships came, they did not just steal silver. They stole people. They stole futures. They stole identities. And so, while fire may have consumed Paris's outer villages in 845, it was chains that carried the true wealth of the raid back north. In those chains walked the beginning of an institution, one that would grow in scale and permanence as the Viking Age deepened. What began as opportunistic raiding soon hardened into a system. At first, the Vikings descended like storms swift, destructive, then gone with the tide. But as the years passed, patterns emerged. Raiding parties grew into expeditions. Expeditions became networks, and human capture shifted from a byproduct of war into one of its central objectives. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking-controlled ports were no longer just staging grounds for war. They had become hubs of commerce, pulsing with trade in a new kind of currency, human bodies. Dublin in Ireland, Hedeby in Denmark, and Birka in Sweden rose as some of the most notorious markets in medieval Europe. Foreign travellers left stunned accounts. Byzantine emissaries, accustomed to their own empire's slave markets, still remarked on the volume of captives sold in the north. Arab geographers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan and Ibn Rusta described scenes in which boys and girls, taken from faraway coasts, stood on display before eager buyers. The trade was brutal in its simplicity. Age, strength, and beauty determined price. The captives themselves reflected the vast reach of Viking raids. Blonde-haired Baltic girls, prized for their rarity, fetched high sums. Slavic boys captured in Eastern Europe were transported west to serve as labourers, or further south to Muslim markets. Dark-haired women from Iberia, taken during coastal raids, were paraded as exotic treasures. In Dublin, chronicles describe markets teeming with languages: Old Norse, Celtic, Slavic, Arabic. It was a place where human suffering was translated into silver. Yet among these captives, some were not destined for fields or households. They were set apart, selected not for endurance, but for appearance, pliability, and the whims of their captors. These became pleasure slaves. The Norse elite jarls, chieftains, powerful landowners saw such captives as emblems of wealth and virility. A man might boast of his thralls as another might boast of his livestock or weaponry. To own a dozen slaves was status. To select a few for the bedroom was proof of dominance. Sagas hint at this reality with unsettling detachment. The Laxdela saga, for instance, tells of Olaf the Peacock, who acquired an Irish slave woman renowned for her beauty. She was gifted to him like a prize horse, renamed, and forced into motherhood. Her children born into a world where her consent was irrelevant. Her personhood erased. The saga recounts her role as if it were no more remarkable than a marriage alliance. But the silence about her feelings, her past, and even her true name speaks volumes. Archaeological discoveries corroborate what the sagas obscure. Excavations in Dublin have uncovered pens and holding cells large enough to contain hundreds of captives at once. At Hedeby, shackles and collars rusted into the earth tell of the same system. Human beings were warehoused, priced, sold, and shipped like timber or iron. This was no longer raiding. This was industry. And at the heart of it, the pleasure slave was transformed into more than property. She, or sometimes he, was recast as a living emblem of power, a body through which domination was performed again and again. The system was not only about labor or profit, it was about reshaping identity itself, captor into master, captive into object. In this way, the Vikings joined a pattern seen across empires. Just as Romans filled their villas with enslaved concubines, and just as caliphs maintained harems of captives, the Norse elite integrated sexual slavery into their fabric of status. What makes the Viking case haunting, however, is how little of it was written down. The sagas preferred warriors, kings, poets. The victims remained voiceless, their suffering reduced to hints, their humanity preserved only in archaeology and foreign accounts. By the time the Vikings settled permanently in places like Ireland, Iceland, and England, the slave system was no longer incidental. It was an institution. Markets flourished, buyers haggled, and ships carried not only furs and silver, but chained lives. It was in these markets, under foreign skies, that the fates of countless men, women, and children were sealed. Some would never see their homeland again. Some would become servants, workers, soldiers, and some, chosen for beauty or youth, would be drawn into a darker, more intimate bondage, the kind that erased not just their freedom, but their very identity. For most captives, the journey ended not in the marketplace, but in the longhouse. It was here, beneath the timber beams blackened with smoke, that the true meaning of being a thrall revealed itself. The Norse word sounded simple, almost benign, but in practice, it marked a life stripped of choice. There were thralls who worked the fields, rising with the sun to till soil that was not theirs, or to haul water through endless winters. Others laboured indoors, grinding grain, tending fires, raising children who would never call them mother or father. But beyond these roles, in the shadowed corners of Norse society, existed another category, the pleasure thralls. Unlike field slaves, these individuals were chosen for something else: beauty, youth, exotic origin qualities that mark them as valuable for more than labor. They were dressed in finery or stripped bare, trained to entertain, to sing, to dance, and most of all, to submit. To own such a slave was to proclaim one's power. To display them was to remind guests that one's dominance extended beyond the battlefield into the most private spaces of life. The sagas offer fleeting glimpses. In Laxdæla saga, Olaf the Peacock's mother, an Irish woman of striking beauty, was passed from one man to another as though she were a prize horse. Her lineage, her name, her consent erased, yet she bore children who would enter the Icelandic aristocracy. Her story is told without outrage, only as an aside in the tale of Olaf's grandeur. It is in this absence, in what is not said, that the enormity of her suffering becomes visible. The festivals of the Norse gods added another layer of horror. During blots, sacrificial feasts dedicated to Odin, Thor, or Freyr. Sexual domination of thralls was sometimes ritualized as part of the offering. Foreign observers describe scenes where violence was cloaked as devotion, where the degradation of captives was reframed as sacred duty. In these moments, a thrall was not just an object of desire, but a sacrifice, her humiliation woven into the spiritual fabric of her captor's world. Archaeology whispers what sagas silence. Graves of powerful Viking men have been unearthed with the remains of young women at their feet, sometimes locals, but often not. DNA analysis confirms foreign origins: Irish, Slavic, Baltic. Their bones tell their own story. Some show signs of trauma-broken ribs, injuries that healed unevenly. Others were positioned in postures of submission, hands crossed unnaturally at the chest or laid like offerings beside weapons and gold. These were not wives buried in honor. They were captives forced to follow in death as they had in life. Imagine their daily reality. The longhouse was no refuge, but a theatre of control. Every sound, the footsteps outside the door, the creak of the roof beams in winter, could mean danger. A summons might lead to drudgery or to degradation. Smiles from the master were not kindness, but pride. Pride in possession. For the thrall, survival meant silence, obedience, or the careful, subtle art of resistance. Too quiet to be punished, but just loud enough to keep a fragment of self intact. This was the hidden architecture of Viking society. Beneath the sails, beneath the axes, beneath the poetry of conquest, lay the silenced bodies who sustained it. Without their labor, the longships would not have been provisioned. Without their exploitation, the wealth of Norse chieftains would have been diminished. And without their silence, the Viking myth could not have endured so untarnished. The thralls lived at the edge of memory, denied voices in the sagas, but carved into the very soil of Scandinavia. And as Viking power stretched outward, east into the rivers of Rus, south toward Byzantium, their numbers multiplied. What had begun as plunder was evolving into a machine and industry of flesh that no longer simply accompanied Viking conquest, but defined it. As the Viking world expanded, the taking of captives grew beyond raiding villages or stocking longhouses. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, slavery had become the very bloodstream of their economy, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the east. Along the river routes of what is now Russia and Ukraine, Scandinavian settlers, the Rus, established thriving centers of power. Kiev rose as the beating heart of this network, a city of wooden fortifications and bustling markets perched along the Dnieper River. From here, human beings were exported in staggering numbers, funneled southward toward the great Islamic caliphates. The geography itself made the trade inevitable. Rivers like the Volkhov, Dnieper, and Volga linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian, highways of water where oars pulled not just furs and amber, but chains. Viking longships carried their cargo downriver, through forests and across rapids, toward the glittering markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Arab travelers recorded what the Norse sagas preferred to ignore. Ibn Rusta, writing in the 10th century, described the Rus as fierce traders who trafficked in human flesh as readily as silver. Ibn Fadlan, sent as an emissary by the Abbasid Caliphate, wrote with both fascination and horror. He described the Norse as tall, tattooed, heavily armed, but what shocked him most was their treatment of slaves bought and sold in crowded markets, some destined for labor, others for sexual servitude. The demand was insatiable. In the Islamic world, harems and domestic servitude were already entrenched institutions. The arrival of pale-skinned captives from the North Slavic boys, Baltic girls, even dark-haired Iberians taken in raids and shipped east, only fed the appetite. Contemporary sources describe these captives being sold in bulk, lined up before buyers who inspected them like livestock. The Rus prospered. For them, human trade was not shameful, it was lucrative. In a society where silver coins from the Abbasids have been found by the thousands in Scandinavian soil, every captive was a piece of currency, every chain another link in the global economy of bodies. But the system was not purely transactional. For Viking leaders, the ownership of certain captives, particularly pleasure slaves, became a public performance of dominance. To display a foreign woman adorned in fine linen, to force her to sing in a language no one else understood, was to prove mastery not only over her body, but over the world that had produced her. She was both ornament and warning, living testimony to her master's reach. Archaeology confirms the industrial scale of this trade. Hordes of Islamic silver dirhams have been unearthed across Sweden, their numbers so vast they could not have been acquired through raiding alone. They speak of steady, structured commerce, and behind the silver lay human livesmen, women, and children whose stories dissolved into the clinking of coins. By the height of this trade, the Viking world was no longer defined only by raids on monasteries or daring voyages to distant shores. It was defined by its role in a global network of flesh. From Kiev to Dublin, from Hedeby to Novgorod, the Norse were not just raiders. They were traffickers. And at the heart of it, the most chilling truth remained. These were not faceless commodities. They were people, each with a stolen name, a severed history, and a fate dictated by the whims of others. In the great halls of the Rus, as foreign silver piled high, pleasure slaves stood as living trophies, proof that conquest was not measured only in battlefields won, but in lives broken and remade into property. What was it like to live as a pleasure slave in a Viking household? History rarely answers this directly. The sagas are silent, the chroniclers evasive, the archaeology mute. And yet, through fragments, imagination, and the raw logic of domination, a picture emerges. Imagine being taken from a warm village, from family and tongue, into a land where the sky was always grey. You do not understand the language. The gestures are foreign, the songs strange, the rituals terrifying. Every night, the crunch of footsteps outside your door is a reason for dread. Every summons carries uncertainty. Will it be for labour or for worse? The daily rhythm of such a life was built not on routine, but on fear. Fear of punishment, fear of humiliation, fear of being noticed, and fear of being forgotten. The master's smile was not kindness, it was pride. You were not seen as a person, but as a possession living proof of his conquest, a symbol of status to display before rivals and guests. For the Norse elite, domination was more than physical control. It was psychological theatre, a thrall's silence, her bowed head, his forced obedience. These were public performances of a chieftain's power. To own another body, to bend it to one's will, was validation not just of wealth, but of masculinity, an extension of the warrior ethos that celebrated conquest in all its forms. The Viking worldview did not label this as perverse. In their moral universe, strength was virtue, and weakness was proof of fate. To subjugate another human being was not corruption. It was confirmation of one's rightful place in the hierarchy of gods and men. A captive's degradation was transformed into an ornament of honor. And yet within this suffocating structure, some captives resisted. Not with open revolt, such uprisings were rare and suicidal, but with quieter forms of defiance. Resistance lived in silence, in withheld words, in stolen glances exchanged between captives. It lived in the act of remembering one's true name when forced to answer to another. It lived in endurance, the refusal to break, to forget, to become the thing the master wanted. Modern psychologists call this micro-resistance, the subtle assertion of humanity in the face of absolute control. For Viking pleasure slaves, such acts were rarely visible, rarely recorded, but they were real, because survival was itself defiance. Every heartbeat, every breath carried in chains, was a refusal of annihilation. Still, the price of resistance was high. Captives who faltered were beaten, mocked, or worse. Some sagas describe thralls killed for amusement, or subjected to ritualized humiliation during festivals. Others hint at practices so cruel they border on the unspeakable, as if the writers themselves recoiled even while trying to preserve the memory. And yet, through these fragments, one haunting truth emerges. The pleasure slaves' suffering was not incidental, it was central. Their humiliation was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate instrument of power, woven into the very logic of Norse society. To dominate another was to affirm one's place in the cosmos. To resist even silently was to declare, in the smallest way possible, that one was still human. This paradox, absolute control, yet fragile resistance, defined the psychology of Viking pleasure slavery. It was not simply about labor or lust. It was about turning human beings into canvases upon which power was drawn, over and over again. And in rare cases, that resistance broke through the silence and found its way into the sagas. The most striking example comes from the story of Melkorka, the mute Irish slave girl, whose quiet defiance would one day shake an entire household. Among the sagas texts that usually exalt kings, warriors, and poets, there are rare moments when a captive's voice slips through, however faint. One of the most haunting belongs to a woman named Melkorka, whose story comes to us from the Laxdæla saga. She enters the narrative almost invisibly, described as a mute Irish slave girl purchased in Norway and taken to Iceland by a man named Hoskuld. For months, she spoke no word. Her silence was interpreted as stupidity, as simple-mindedness, proof of her lowly state. To Hoskuld, she was pliable because she was voiceless. He used her as he wished, confident in her inability to resist or to speak her pain aloud. But silence can conceal more than weakness. One night, when Hoskuld struck her in frustration, Melkorka turned to him and, for the first time, spoke. Her words were not broken Norse, but fluent, noble Irish. She cursed him. She revealed that she had never been mute at all. Her silence had been deliberate, an act of defiance, a way of refusing to yield her language, her identity, her dignity. In that moment, she reclaimed something her captivity had sought to erase, her voice. Her true name was Melkorka, daughter of an Irish king. She had been seized in a raid, torn from her homeland, and sold into slavery. Her muteness was not submission, but resistance, a psychological rebellion in a world where rebellion seemed impossible. By withholding speech, she preserved a part of herself untouched by her master's control. From her forced union with Hoskuld came a son Olaf, later called Olaf, the Peacock. Though born of rape, Olaf grew into wealth and power. His striking foreign features, dark hair, almond-shaped eyes, set him apart in Iceland, but they also carried the memory of his mother's stolen lineage. Years later, Olaf travelled to Ireland, where he met Melkorka's father, the Irish king, and confirmed the truth of her story. In that meeting, history itself seemed to pause. The grandson of a king, born of violence in a foreign land, standing as living proof that even in chains, identity can survive. And yet, Melkorka's own fate remained bound to Iceland. She never returned to her homeland. Though treated with a measure of respect after her secret was revealed, she lived and died still technically a slave, her freedom never formally restored. Her story, preserved in fragments, is bittersweet. A tale of survival, of a voice that refused erasure, but also of a life that never fully escaped captivity. What makes Melkorka's defiance so powerful is not that she toppled her master or reclaimed her throne. It is that she chose silence and then speech on her own terms. In a world designed to strip her of every choice, that small act of control became a rebellion. Her story is rare, but it reminds us of a wider truth. Even in the darkest corners of Viking society, resistance existed. Not always in battles or uprisings, but in whispers, in memories, in the refusal to let identity be extinguished. Through Melkorka, the silence of countless unnamed captives finds a fleeting voice. A voice that tells us that even when history erases, humanity remembers. If life as a thrall was defined by submission, death did not always bring release. For some captives, the grave was merely another extension of servitude. Archaeology across Scandinavia has revealed a chilling pattern. Slaves buried alongside their masters, their bodies arranged not in honor, but in subjugation. One such grave, uncovered near Birka in Sweden, tells the story more starkly than words ever could. A high-ranking Viking man lay surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and finery signs of status and wealth. At his feet lay the remains of a young woman. Her bones bore the marks of violence. She had not died of old age or illness. She had been killed, deliberately, to accompany him into the afterlife. This was not an isolated discovery. In several sites, archaeologists have found female skeletons buried in positions of forced submission, hands bound, bodies placed at the base of a man's bier, as though arranged for eternal service. These were not wives, equal partners in the journey to Valhalla. They were slaves, possibly pleasure slaves, condemned to follow their masters even beyond death. The sagas themselves hint at the practice, though with a veil of detachment. Death feasts and sacrificial rites often mention slaves chosen to accompany warriors. But it is foreign accounts that pull away the veil and reveal the brutality. In the 10th century, the Arab emissary Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River. His account has haunted historians ever since. A wealthy Norseman had died, and preparations for his burial began. Among his slaves, a girl was chosen to accompany him into the afterlife. At first, Ibn Fadlan wrote, she seemed cheerful. She smiled, declared her willingness, even drank and sang. But beneath her composure lay resignation. Her fate had already been decided. The rituals were elaborate. She was given intoxicants, and in a grotesque farewell, she was forced to sleep with several of her master's companions. This was framed not as degradation, but as honoring her master in death. Finally, she was taken aboard the ship where his body lay, dressed in fine linen, adorned with ornaments. There, before the gathered crowd, an old woman whom Ibn Fadlan called the Angel of Death stabbed her with a knife, strangled her, and arranged her body beside the corpse. The ship was then set ablaze, a blazing pyre carrying both master and slave into what the Norse believed was the next world. Ibn Fadlan recorded the event with horror, unable to disguise his revulsion. He saw the girl's initial smiles not as willing sacrifice, but as forced ritual. In his eyes, her fate was not noble. It was obliteration. And yet, among the Vikings, such acts were revered. They believed a warrior should not go alone into the afterlife. His possessions, his weapons, even his slaves were to accompany him, ensuring his dominance would continue beyond the grave. For the Norse, this was cosmic order. For the captives, it was annihilation of body, spirit, and memory. The symbolism is chilling. To the master, a slave was not merely flesh in life, but a token of his greatness in eternity. To erase her individuality, to consume her in flames beside him, was the final act of ownership. It was not enough to command her living body. He must also command her death. This mingling of religion, sexuality, and violence reveals the darkest edge of the Viking worldview. Domination was not simply a matter of earthly power. It was sanctified, woven into myth, justified by the gods themselves. To enslave a body was one thing. To claim that body even in death was to rewrite the cosmos in the image of power. And yet, when we strip away the sagas, the rituals, the flames of burning ships, one truth remains unshaken. Her life was never hers to live, and her death was never hers to choose. For the Norse elite, domination was never confined to the walls of the longhouse. It stretched into the sacred, braided into the rituals that defined their relationship with gods and cosmos. To enslave another body was not only a matter of status or desire, it was a reflection of divine order. The Blots sacrificial feasts held in honor of Odin, Thor, or Freya were not only about animals slaughtered for the gods, they could also become spectacles of carnal power. Chronicles and later interpretations suggest that slaves, particularly women, were sometimes forced into ritualized displays of submission before their deaths. These acts were framed as offerings, their humiliation transformed into a kind of worship. In the Norse worldview, blood and sex, death and pleasure were threads of the same tapestry, each act of dominance confirming a master's strength before gods and men alike. The power over life and death extended beyond rituals. Names themselves became instruments of control. A slave's original name, foreign, resonant with another culture, was often stripped away, replaced with something Norse, something easier to own. Others were mocked with degrading nicknames, their identities bent until they no longer recognized themselves. This was not incidental cruelty. It was deliberate annihilation of the self, the rewriting of a human being into a symbol. In this way, domination became cosmic. To own a thrall was not just to command her labor or his obedience. It was to reshape fate, to bend another life into a reflection of one's own myth. A chieftain who sacrificed a slave at a feast was not only proving his might to his rivals, he was performing his role as a man blessed by the gods, a figure whose authority reached beyond the mortal realm. We see this logic echoed across empires. Romans justified sexual slavery as a natural right of conquest. Abbasid caliphs cloaked their harems in sanctity, framing them as microcosms of divine order. The Norse, too, sanctified their cruelty. To dominate another body was not simply indulgence. It was an act aligned with the very fabric of their belief system. And yet, this sanctification carried within it a more chilling implication. For the victim, there was no refuge, not in body, not in memory, not even in spirit. Their degradation was not only tolerated, but blessed, folded into rituals that claimed to sustain the universe. To resist was not only rebellion against a master, but defiance of the gods themselves. This was the deepest sickness at the heart of the Viking slave system. It blurred the line between power and piety, between lust and law. It ensured that even the most intimate forms of domination could be reframed as holy. But cracks were beginning to form in this cosmic armor. For as the Norse world encountered Christianity first through captured monks, then through political conversions, new voices began to challenge the sanctity of these practices. They did not end slavery, but they planted seeds of doubt, a dissonance that would grow as the Viking Age waned. As the Viking Age stretched into the 10th and 11th centuries, new winds began to stir across the north. Christianity, once a foreign creed whispered by trembling monks in the ruins of plundered monasteries, crept steadily into the Norse world. It came not first as faith, but as captives. Monks and priests dragged from cloisters brought with them more than prayers, they brought words. They wrote of what they saw, of the slaughter and the enslavement, and in doing so, they reframed Viking power not as glory, but as sin. To the Norse, such accusations at first meant little. The old gods still demanded sacrifice. The old rituals still bound men to their ancestors. But Christianity offered something else: legitimacy. By the late 10th century, Viking leaders recognized that survival in a rapidly Christianizing Europe required more than swords and silver. It required recognition. And recognition meant conversion. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson seized the cross as much for politics as for piety. To be baptized was to be welcomed at foreign courts, to trade openly, to secure alliances sealed not only by marriages, but by shared faith. Conversion was a tool, and with it came laws that began to chip away at the older pagan practices. Sacrificial rites were among the first targets. The killing of slaves to accompany a master into the afterlife was condemned as barbaric, a stain on a king who wished to be counted as civilized. Some forms of public ritual slavery were outlawed, replaced with penances and church tithes. The old gods could no longer be fed with blood. But this was not liberation. It was substitution. The church condemned ritual sacrifice but tolerated slavery itself. So long as the enslaved were heathens, their servitude could even be reframed as salvation. To own a thrall was to shepherd a soul away from paganism, even if that salvation was carried out through chains, humiliation, and exploitation. The shadows of Christianity fell unevenly. In some courts, like that of Olaf Haraldsson, laws were written against certain brutal practices, and the role of the thrall shifted subtly. In others, the old ways continued in private, cloaked from clerical eyes. Archaeology suggests that long after laws banned sacrificial killings, young women were still buried with their masters, silent testaments to a persistence stronger than decrees. And so, while Christianity introduced cracks into the moral armor of Viking society, it did not shatter it. The system of domination endured, merely reshaped. What was once celebrated as cosmic duty now retreated into shadow. Rituals once public became secret. Violence once sacred became quietly excused. The thralls did not feel the difference. A captive girl forced into her master's bed in the year 1020 suffered no less than her counterpart a century earlier. The only change was in the justification. What had once been declared as service to Odin was now masked as obedience to Christ. But the cracks widened. With each generation, the Christian language of sin, legitimacy, and morality seeped deeper into Norse society. The sagas themselves, written centuries later by Christian authors, reflect the dissonance. They recount the grandeur of chieftains and jarls but hesitate at the edges, their silences betraying unease at the cruelties of the past. It is within these silences, between old gods and new, that the Viking world began to fracture, not only politically, but morally. And in this fracture, another unsettling truth emerged. Women, too, could wield the power of slavery. They were not always the victims we imagine. Sometimes, they became its enforcers. When we picture Viking women, two images usually emerge. The first is the shield maiden, armored and fearless, striding into battle alongside men. The second is the dutiful wife, weaving in the longhouse, waiting for her husband's return from the sea. Yet history is rarely so simple. In truth, Viking women, particularly those of noble households, often stood in the middle ground between victim and master. And sometimes they leaned toward the latter. Within the Norse household, the mistress called the husfru, or housewife in the sagas, was more than a passive figure. She was the manager of the home, the steward of its provisions, and critically, the overseer of its slaves. While her husband raided, governed, or feasted, it was she who ensured the thralls obeyed. And this authority extended even to pleasure slaves. For the wife, these women represented more than property. They were threats. Chosen for beauty, pliability, and youth, they could easily attract the affection or obsession of a husband. Some bore him children, living reminders of her own replaceability. In a world where marriages were often political, where love was secondary to alliances, the presence of a concubine or pleasure slave was a wound to both pride and power. The sagas reveal the rawness of this tension. In one tale, a mistress, consumed with jealousy, blinded her husband's concubine with a sewing needle. Another story tells of slaves deliberately disfigured, crippled, scarred, or maimed to diminish their desirability. These acts are described almost clinically, as though they were matters of household maintenance rather than cruelty. In some cases, the mistress herself was the one to select which slave would be dressed, adorned, and offered during ritual feasts, decisions that blurred lines between victimhood and complicity. Perhaps the most infamous of these women was Queen Gunhild, wife of Eric Bloodaxe. The sagas portray her as cunning, seductive, even cruel. She is accused of sorcery, of manipulating men with her body and her will. While much of this may be later slander colored by Christian morality, beneath it lies a kernel of truth. Gunhild, like many high-born women, held real power. And part of that power came from her role in directing and disciplining slaves. The irony is cruel. In a patriarchal society, where a woman's authority was often limited, mastery over slaves, especially female slaves, offered a bitter kind of empowerment. To stand above another woman, to control her food, her dress, her survival, became a way of reinforcing one's own precarious place in the hierarchy. Power trickled downward, and so too did cruelty. But not all Viking women embraced this role. Some, especially those who themselves had once been enslaved and later elevated to wives or concubines of favor, showed empathy. Yet even empathy carried its own contradictions. A former slave who became mistress might extend kindness to those beneath her, or she might replicate the abuse she once endured, perpetuating the cycle. The line between compassion and complicity blurred easily. The saga of Thorgerdur, for example, describes a woman taken as a captive in her youth, who later married into modest status. When she herself came to own slaves, she treated them harshly, defending her cruelty by saying, "This is the way of the house. I learned it from better hands than mine." Her words echo across centuries like an indictment, proof of how abuse replicates itself when left unchecked. And so, Viking women cannot be painted simply as victims or heroines. Some were enforcers, some were overseers, some were participants in the rituals that condemned other women. For them, power was not found in battlefields, but in corridors of control over food, over bodies, over survival itself. In this way, the Viking system of slavery was not sustained only by the brutality of men, but by the complicity, sometimes willing, sometimes coerced, of women. And this makes its legacy even darker, for it reminds us that the machinery of oppression is rarely the work of one hand. It is upheld by many, each seeking to survive, to secure status, to cling to scraps of power in a world built on domination. The story of Viking slavery is not just one of domination inflicted from above. It is also a story of cycles of trauma passed from hand to hand. replicated by those who once suffered it. The brutality of the system was not only imposed, it was learned, absorbed, and then reenacted. Consider the account of Thorgerda Thorbergsdottir, preserved in the Sturlunga saga. She had been taken as a captive during a feud in her youth, forced to serve in another household where years of humiliation shaped her life. Eventually, she was freed not out of mercy, but because her captor had grown bored of her. She married into modest standing, gaining a measure of respectability. But when she herself acquired an Irish thrall, her treatment of the girl mirrored the abuse she had endured. She dictated what the girl ate, when she slept, how she dressed, even offering her to male guests. When questioned, she defended her cruelty. "This is the way of the house. I learned it from better hands than mine." Her words are chilling because they reveal how normalized such violence had become. Survival within the system often meant internalizing its rules, repeating them upon others when the chance arose. Those who had been powerless sometimes craved scraps of power when they finally stood above someone else. The result was a cycle of cruelty that replicated itself across generations, embedding domination deep within the culture. Religion, rather than breaking the cycle, sometimes reinforced it. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, certain pagan rituals were outlawed, but the core institution of slavery remained. The language merely shifted. A thrall was no longer sacrificed to Odin, but could be framed as a soul, saved through servitude to a Christian master. The body remained bound, only the justification changed. This hypocrisy runs like a vein through medieval Europe. The Church condemned ritual human sacrifice, while simultaneously blessing wars that produced captives. In the Viking world, this translated into a strange moral landscape. Public displays of slave humiliation diminished, but private abuse continued, shielded by the veneer of Christian respectability. Sexual servitude, especially, lingered in the shadows, no longer ritualized in blots, but tolerated as a private sin, excused by the lowly status of the enslaved. The psychological toll of such a system is difficult to measure, but easy to imagine. A woman raised in bondage, who later gained freedom, would carry her scars forward, shaping how she treated others. A child who watched his enslaved mother beaten might grow into a man who equated cruelty with authority. Trauma became inheritance. Oppression, once endured, was transformed into a manual for how to survive and how to dominate when the chance arose. This is perhaps the darkest truth of the Viking slave system. It was self-perpetuating. It did not only dehumanize its immediate victims, it taught lessons of power that outlived the captors themselves. The enslaved who became free might repeat the same patterns, convinced they were upholding the way of the house. And in doing so, the system ensured its own survival long after the old gods had fallen and the cross had risen on northern shores. The cycle of abuse meant that even abolition, when it came, could not undo what generations had learned. The laws that ended slavery did not erase the habits of domination, the social memory of humiliation, or the buried stories of women who had survived by inflicting upon others what had once been inflicted upon them. In this, the Viking world was no different from others. From Rome to Baghdad, from the Americas to the Ottoman courts, slavery always taught the same grim lesson. When survival demands cruelty, cruelty becomes tradition. From the silence of Viking longhouses emerged another haunting legacy: children born of slaves. In Norse lore, they were known as frillborn offspring of concubines, or more bluntly, of slaves. These children were neither fully free nor fully enslaved. They lived in limbo, their very existence a reminder of violence and conquest. Legitimacy mattered deeply in the Viking world. Bloodlines determined inheritance, honor, and one's place in the saga-telling that preserved memory. A child born to a free woman carried her father's name proudly, but a child born of a thrall bore a shadow. Unless the father explicitly acknowledged the child, their status was fragile. Some remained slaves. Others were raised within the household, tolerated, but never truly accepted. The most famous of these children is Olaf the Peacock, son of Hoskuld and the Irish slave woman Melkorka. Olaf grew up in wealth, dressed in finery that made him one of Iceland's most flamboyant figures. His nickname, the Peacock, came from his extravagant clothing and polished demeanor, yet beneath the silks lay unease. His dark features, hair, eyes, complexion set him apart in Iceland, where his peers whispered of his foreign mother. Though wealthy and respected, he could never escape the contradiction of his birth. Son of a chieftain, yet also son of a slave. Some historians suggest Olaf's obsession with appearance, his need to dazzle and impress, was a defense against stigma. His performance of wealth became armor against whispers of illegitimacy. He thrived in the saga tradition, remembered for his travels and connections. But his very prominence reveals how fragile identity could be. Without his father's acknowledgement, he might have remained invisible, a thrall's child, lost to memory. For most Frillborn, there was no saga to preserve their names. If a master refused to claim paternity, the child inherited the mother's status. Many grew up in bondage, forced to labor beside the woman who bore them. Even when acknowledged, their lives were marked by tension. A wife might resent her husband's illegitimate offspring, treating the child as a living wound to her honor. Rivalries festered in households, where legitimate and illegitimate children grew side by side. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. Imagine a boy growing up in a longhouse, dressed decently, educated modestly, yet always reminded that his mother was once property. His very existence whispered of humiliation. Or a girl, raised under the jealous gaze of her master's wife, treated kindly one day and cruelly the next. These children learned early that they were reminders, walking embodiments of conquest and shame. And yet, paradoxically, some Frillborn became bridges between worlds. In mixed communities like Dublin, York, and Novgorod, where Norse, Celtic, and Slavic cultures collided, children of slaves and masters blended into the fabric of society. They learned multiple tongues, navigated divided loyalties, and sometimes leveraged their dual heritage for survival. In these chaotic ports, identity was less rigid than in isolated farms of Iceland or Norway. Still, the shadow of slavery followed them, a mark that even wealth could not fully erase. The sagas rarely dwell on their inner lives, but the silences are telling. Behind every prominent figure, like Olaf the Peacock, stood hundreds of unnamed children whose fathers never claimed them, whose mothers whispered their names in secret. They were born of silence, raised in ambiguity, and taught from their first breath that their existence was conditional. In a society that measured worth through lineage, the Frillborn stood as contradictions, proof that blood could carry both honor and shame. And in that contradiction, they embodied the deepest scar of the Viking slave system, the way it reshaped not only lives, but generations. As the Viking world drifted further into the Christian age, the position of the Frillborn children grew even more precarious. In the old pagan order, their status was ambiguous but flexible. A father could choose to acknowledge his slave-born child, granting him or her a place in the household, sometimes even in the inheritance. The system was brutal, but it allowed space for exceptions, rare stories, like Olaf the Peacock, who rose despite his mother's enslavement. Christianity, however, reframed the rules. It brought with it new language, sin, legitimacy, marriage. Where once a child of a thrall might be stigmatized socially, now they were branded spiritually. They were not only bastards in the eyes of men, but children of sin in the eyes of God. This new framework cut deeper because it denied them not just inheritance, but moral standing. Laws hardened. By the early 12th century, decrees in Norway and Iceland stated that a slave-born child could not inherit land unless publicly recognized by the father. In many cases, even recognition was not enough. Illegitimacy itself became a disqualification. Where pagan society had once blurred lines, Christianity drew them sharply, creating new divides between the legitimate and the illegitimate. The consequences rippled across lives. Sons of concubines, once able to fight for recognition, were now systematically excluded from political and religious power. They could not inherit land, nor enter the priesthood, nor marry into noble families. Daughters fared little better. They might be married off to lesser men or hidden away in convents, sometimes by choice, often by force. In monasteries, these girls became ghosts of their families, carrying the unspoken shame of origins too dangerous to mention. And yet, in the Viking trade hubs where cultures mixed, the lines blurred again. In Dublin, York, and Novgorod, children of mixed backgrounds grew up alongside foreign traders, warriors, and captives. These cities thrived on ambiguity. Legitimacy mattered less when survival depended on barter and strength. Here, a frillborn child might find paths unavailable in rural Scandinavia. Some became traders fluent in multiple languages, others mercenaries who turned stigma into ferocity. Still, the shadow of their birth lingered. They could never fully escape the whisper. Son of a slave, daughter of a thrall. The sagas are largely silent about them. They prefer to focus on chieftains, warriors, poets, those whose names carried pride. The unnamed children, born into half-worlds of silence and shame, vanish between the lines. Yet their absence is telling. Their omission is part of the erasure, a quiet reminder of how deeply society wished to forget them. And so, the inheritance of stigma outlived even slavery itself. By the time laws formally abolished the thrall class, the social stain remained. A child of enslaved blood could never fully escape the weight of ancestry. It lingered in whispers, in glances, in marriages denied, in lands withheld. This is the cruel paradox. Freedom could be written into law, but memory remained enslaved. And for the children of thralls, the chains were not always on their bodies. They were written into their names, their blood, their futures. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the world that had birthed the Viking Age was changing. Longships still cut across northern waters, but the rhythm of raids had slowed. Christian monarchies consolidated power, trade routes shifted, and the economy of Scandinavia began to transform. And with these changes came the gradual unraveling of the slave system. The first cracks appeared in Iceland. In 1117, the island's lawmakers codified a sweeping set of rules known as gragas. Among them was a provision that formally abolished slavery. The decision was less a moral awakening than a practical necessity. Iceland, with its small population and harsh environment, could no longer sustain the open buying and selling of human beings. It was easier, more profitable to bind men and women to land as tenants and labourers, rather than as outright property. Norway and Sweden followed in the century after, phasing out the legal framework of slavery. By the 13th century, thralls had vanished from the law codes of Scandinavia. Denmark too transitioned into a feudal structure, where serfdom replaced enslavement. In theory, the chains were broken. In practice, they were replaced by new bonds of dependence, softer, but still constraining. The reasons were economic as much as ideological. The flourishing of European trade meant silver, once the currency of slave markets, now flowed more steadily through legitimate commerce. Feudalism made peasants more predictable sources of labour. And Christianity, for all its compromises, created pressure to align with European norms, where outright slavery was becoming less common. To be a kingdom of slaves was to risk being seen as barbaric. Yet abolition on parchment did not erase centuries of trauma. thralls did not simply vanish. They became absorbed into the lower classes, their names forgotten, but their bloodlines enduring. In fishing villages along the Norwegian coast, in Icelandic farms, in Swedish hamlets, descendants of thralls lived on, indistinguishable in time from their freeborn neighbours, yet carrying histories never spoken aloud. The sagas, written in this transitional period, reflect the ambiguity. They are full of warriors and kings, but their silence on the end of slavery is deafening. It is as though the authors, themselves Christian descendants of a society built on bondage, wish to smooth over the past. The thralls, who had once been central to Viking wealth, fade into the background, erased as the ink of new laws dried. But archaeology resists forgetting. Shackles rusted in the earth, burial pits of foreigners in Scandinavian soil, genetic traces that do not match the local population, all speak of a reality too vast to vanish. Even as the legal category of thrall disappeared, the human cost remained, etched into the land and blood of the North. So the decline of slavery in Scandinavia was not a triumph of morality, but a transformation of systems. The thrall became a tenant farmer, a serf, a forgotten ancestor, and in that forgetting lay both survival and erasure. The chains were broken, yes, but their echoes lingered in silence, in stigma, in memory. Even after the word thrall vanished from law codes, its shadows remained in bodies, in blood, and in memory. Slavery in Scandinavia was never just an economic system. It was a reshaping of people, a silent rewriting of ancestry. And centuries after the last chains were broken, its echoes still whisper through the North. Modern science has begun to unearth what sagas refuse to preserve. Genetic studies in Iceland, Ireland, and the British Isles reveal maternal lineages that do not match the local population. Strands of Baltic, Slavic, Iberian, and even North African ancestry appear unexpectedly, carried not by conquering warriors, but by women who were taken as captives. These bloodlines are silent witnesses to forgotten journeys, women dragged from their homes, forced into unions, and absorbed into families that never acknowledged their names. Archaeology, too, uncovers the traces. Foreign ornaments buried in Scandinavian soil. Skeletons with non-local isotopes. Proof of origins hundreds of miles away. Graves of men accompanied by women who did not belong to their kin, their bones telling stories the sagas chose not to. These discoveries dismantle the myth of a pure Norse identity. They reveal instead a society woven through with the lives of outsiders, absorbed not by choice, but by coercion. And yet, in cultural memory, the silence persists. The sagas glorify warriors, kings, explorers. They celebrate voyages to Vinland, victories in battle, and the honor of heroes. The thralls are mentioned only in passing, unnamed, voiceless, erased. In the modern revival of Viking imagery, in films, television, and even political propaganda, the erasure continues. We see axes, sails, feasts, and battles, but rarely the captives who cooked those feasts, built those ships, and warmed those beds under duress. Still, the echoes endure. In Iceland, some family lines whisper of descent from Irish women brought over in the Age of Settlement. In Russia, the very word Rus carries the imprint of Scandinavians who built their wealth through the traffic of human lives. In the British Isles, genetic anomalies trace the faint outline of women taken long ago, their survival encoded in descendants who know nothing of their names. The legacy is haunting because it is invisible. It lingers not in monuments or chronicles, but in quiet details, an unusual eye shape, a darker complexion, a forgotten story passed in a family line. It is the survival of the silenced, hidden in plain sight. This, perhaps, is the truest mark of Viking slavery, that it left behind no proud record, no epic poem, no saga of conquest. It left behind people. Bloodlines scattered like seeds across continents. Roots hidden deep. Branches grown into families who may never know the soil from which they sprang. And so, in the genetic code of the North, in the bones beneath its soil, in the whispers that outlast erasure, the voices of thralls still murmur. They remind us that history does not vanish when written out of books. It persists in flesh and memory, waiting for someone willing to listen. Today, the Vikings loom larger than ever in the global imagination. We see them everywhere, on television, in video games, on the banners of sports teams. They stride across screens as fearless adventurers, hornless helmets gleaming, axes swinging, their sails snapping against icy winds. They are celebrated as symbols of rugged freedom, rebellion, and untamed masculinity. But this myth, carefully polished over centuries, comes at a cost. It is selective. It remembers the roar of longships, but not the silence of chained captives below deck. It glorifies the warrior's feast, but forgets the women forced to dance, to sing, to endure humiliation before being dragged into a master's bed. It celebrates exploration and conquest, but erases the stolen futures of those left nameless in its wake. The romantic image of the Viking was not born in the Viking Age itself. It grew later, in the 19th century, when European nationalism sought heroic ancestors. Writers and artists painted the Norse as noble savages, men of steel and honor, a convenient myth for societies seeking roots in valor rather than cruelty. By the time Wagner's operas and Victorian novels had their say, the thralls had been erased almost completely. In their place stood a myth of freedom, adventure, and strength, a myth that still thrives today. Tourism in Scandinavia often continues the erasure. Visitors walk through reconstructed longhouses, hear stories of voyages and battles, admire ships in museums. Rarely do they hear of the slaves who rode those ships under threat, who warmed those houses without thanks, who carried the true weight of Norse society. Even popular television series, while darker in tone, still lean into the allure of the warrior. The spectacle of conquest is always more marketable than the silence of the enslaved. But history demands more of us. To celebrate the Viking spirit without acknowledging its cost is to participate in the same erasure the sagas performed. The myth of the free Norseman ignores the truth that Norse freedom was built on unfreedom, that for every man who claimed liberty with an axe, there were many more who lost theirs in chains. And so the reality stands in stark contrast to the myth. The Viking Age was not just a time of daring exploration. It was also a time of industrialized human trafficking, ritualized domination, and inherited trauma. To tell only half the story is to repeat the silencing of those who never had the chance to speak. This tension between myth and reality still defines how we see the Viking world. One version is intoxicating, marketable, thrilling. The other is unsettling, uncomfortable, necessary. And the question remains, which version will we choose to remember? It would be comforting to imagine that the Vikings were uniquely cruel, that their practices of sexual enslavement were aberrations belonging only to the icy north. But history denies us that comfort. The truth is darker, more universal. The domination of bodies, the turning of people into possessions, has haunted nearly every empire, every continent, every age. The Vikings did not invent the concept of pleasure slaves. They inherited it, adapted it, and exported it. In the Roman world, wealthy citizens filled their villas with enslaved concubines, their bodies treated as extensions of household wealth. In the Abbasid Caliphate, harems overflowed with captives taken from across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Each woman a token of conquest, her identity erased beneath silks and rituals. In the Ottoman markets centuries later, young boys and girls were displayed in public squares, sold with the same detachment as livestock. And across the Atlantic, in the plantations of the American South, sexual slavery was institutionalized, justified, and passed from generation to generation under the guise of property law. What binds all these examples together is not geography, but psychology. In every society, sexual slavery functioned as a performance of power. To own another body, to dictate not just labor but intimacy, was the ultimate expression of dominance. It blurred the line between possession and personhood, collapsing a human life into an ornament of status. The Norse system fits neatly into this grim continuum. Their pleasure slaves were not unique. They were part of a recurring pattern in human history. The sagas obscure the practice, just as Roman poets obscured the suffering of concubines, just as Islamic chroniclers often veiled the harshness of harems behind poetic language. In every age, literature celebrates the master and silences the enslaved. And yet, the universality of this cruelty makes it no less horrifying. If anything, it deepens its weight, for it reveals that what the Vikings did was not an anomaly of their barbaric culture, but a symptom of something more pervasive, the human tendency to mistake domination for greatness, to sanctify violence when it serves power. This recognition also strips away the comfort of distance. To condemn Viking slavery without acknowledging its echoes elsewhere is to miss the larger truth. From antiquity to modernity, from Europe to Africa to the Americas, sexual slavery is a thread that stitches itself across history. The Vikings were one chapter in a book still being written, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that this story is not ancient. It is human, and it persists. In the end, what lingers most about the Viking system of slavery is not only its brutality, but its silence. The sagas, the chronicles, even foreign travelers often wrote more about the masters than the enslaved. The voices of the thralls are gone, swallowed by fire, forgotten in ink. And yet, their survival itself was a form of resistance. For the pleasure slaves, rebellion rarely meant open revolt. There were no mass uprisings, no flaming torches storming longhouses. Instead, resistance took quieter forms. It lived in the refusal to forget one's true name when forced to answer to another. It lived in the lullabies whispered in foreign tongues, in the secret prayers carried from homeland gods into the cold halls of the North. It lived in the simple act of enduring, of surviving one day longer than expected. Silence, so often read as submission, could also be strength. To remain mute, as Melkorka once did, was to hold a fragment of self untouched. To endure humiliation without surrendering identity was to declare humanity in a world designed to erase it. Every small act of defiance, whether it was refusing to break under a blow or exchanging a glance of solidarity with another captive, was survival stitched into the fabric of daily life. Modern psychology calls this covert resistance, the quiet strategies of those denied open power. It rarely makes it into chronicles or sagas, but it is there, hidden in the cracks. Because domination seeks not only to control bodies, but to extinguish spirit. And each time a captive held on to a memory, a story, a fragment of who they were, they denied that extinction. Some bore children, and though those children carried the stigma of their origins, they were proof that their mothers had endured. Some managed to manipulate their circumstances, earning small privileges through wit or endurance. Some, simply by living long enough to pass on bloodlines that survive in the North to this day, became rebels in their own quiet way. Even the nameless resist by existing in traces in bones uncovered in Scandinavian graves, in genetic studies that reveal foreign lineages, in the unspoken knowledge that behind every Viking feast, every raid, every saga, there were those who endured in silence. Their presence, though erased in story, is undeniable in reality. And so, while their voices may never fully return, their survival is itself a voice. It whispers across centuries. We were here. We endured. We were more than what was done to us. Imagine standing on a Norwegian fjord, the wind sharp with salt and snow. Out on the horizon, a longship cuts through the grey water, its dragon prow rising like a predator from the mist. To the world, it looks like a symbol of power, of daring exploration, of a civilization that reshaped Europe. But look beneath the deck, and you find another truth. The silent weight of chained bodies, human cargo that never chose to sail. The Viking Age has long been remembered through the lens of glory raids, conquests, exploration, and endurance. Yet its foundation was also built on the stolen. Men and women dragged from villages, stripped of names, sold as property, forced into rituals of domination that blurred the line between lust and religion. Their stories rarely appear in sagas, but their blood and bones remain as witnesses. When we speak of the Vikings today, we often see axes, sails, beards, and feasts. We rarely see the enslaved woman forced to dance at a banquet before being led to her master's bed. We rarely see the girl dressed in fine linen, not for honor, but for sacrifice. We rarely see the boy who grew up knowing his mother's name was never spoken, his very existence treated as shame. These images are absent from the myth, but they were present in the reality. And that absence matters. Because history is not mythology. To remember only the victors is to let silence win. The Vikings were not uniquely cruel sexual slavery, and human trafficking have existed in Rome, in Baghdad, in the Ottoman courts, on American plantations. The Norse were one chapter in a human story that stretches across continents. But to confront their story, honestly, is to break the spell of romanticization, to resist the allure of blood and steel narratives that erase the suffering beneath. For the enslaved, silence was survival. But for us, silence is complicity. To recover their stories is not only an act of history, it is an act of justice. Even in silence, they resisted. Even in chains, they endured. And though their names are lost, their descendants live on. In the bloodlines of Iceland, Ireland, Russia, and beyond, traces of Baltic, Slavic, Iberian, and African mothers remain. Survivors all. Their legacy is not only trauma, but endurance. So when we speak of the Vikings, let us speak the full truth. Let us honor not just the raiders, but the resisted. Let us remember the stolen, the silenced, the erased. Because history is not just the story of conquest. It is also the story of survival. And if we listen closely, beneath the clash of swords and the roar of longships, we can still hear the quieter sound, the heartbeat of those who endured.